They thought humans were running, panicked, disorganized, collapsing under pressure. Every signal, every retreat, every abandoned outpost confirmed it, and the alien fleet did what any superior force would do. They chased, faster, deeper, without hesitation, because victory was right in front of them. What they didn't realize was that no one had ever escaped a battlefield designed by humans. Not even the ones who thought they were winning. The edge of the Kalar system burned with cold, metallic light as thousands of alien warships held formation, each vessel aligned with mathematical precision, flawless and emotionless, like an equation already solved. From the central command ship, High Commander Vailthar observed the final streams of data arriving from the front, where humanity, an erratic, inefficient species by every prior assessment, was collapsing in what appeared to be a chaotic, desperate retreat. Their communication channels flooded with broken transmissions, overlapping commands, static and distortion suggesting a system tearing itself apart. And across the tactical display, human vessels peeled away one by one, abandoning orbital defenses, resource stations, even intact fortresses left silent and unmanned. And Vailthar allowed himself the smallest tilt of his head, the closest his kind came to satisfaction. "They have reached their limit," he said evenly, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "Human resistance is finished." And no one challenged him, because the data aligned perfectly. Loss ratios, retreat velocity, communication instability, all converging toward a single, inevitable conclusion: Quran collapse. At the far edge of the command chamber, however, a junior officer named Saren remained still, eyes locked onto the flowing data streams. "Command, Heave Wiegand has a Sean lasting only a fraction too long to be considered optimal. Our prolific models of human behavior, Tintin, have never recorded a full-scale retreat of this nature. Vailthar did turn. Then this is the first instance," he replied. "All systems reach a breaking point." Saren's fingers tightened slightly. "But their withdrawal vectors are too clean, sir. There is no orbital congestion, no navigational conflict. They are retreating as if they are still in control," another officer interrupted, a trace of amusement slipping through. "You are attributing competence where the data suggests failure." A few glances flicked toward Saren before returning to the displays, where every projection continued to favor total victory. And Vailthar concluded, "Your hypothesis is unnecessary. The outcome is already determined." On the other side of the battlefield, deep within the space humanity appeared to be abandoning, the reality was very different. Aboard a human command vessel, the lighting was steady, the air calm, officers moved with quiet efficiency. No shouting, no panic, only concise orders and immediate responses. "Delta Formation has cleared mining point 3. One voice reported. "Energy cores successfully extracted. Navigation beacons recalibrated." The commanding officer, a woman with tired but razor-sharp eyes, gave a slight nod. "Maintain distortion on open channels. Increase false signal density in the outer belt. I want them convinced we're breaking apart." A faint chuckle came from another station. "They already are, ma'am. They're following exactly as predicted." She studied the tactical map where enemy vectors stretched deeper into the territory humanity had relinquished. "Not enough," she said quietly. "We need full commitment." Back on the Arian's flagship, reports continued to cascade with mechanical editing. 3 additional human clusters have existed defensive orbit. No self-destruct signals detected from abandoned installations. Their supply chains are completely severed, each update reinforcing the same conclusion. And Vailthar issued the decisive command: "Deploy all fleets. Maintain pursuit formation. No human unit is to escape this sector." Icons shifted instantly across the display as thousands of warships accelerated in unison, engines bending space-time into luminous trails that carved through the void. And Saren watched, unease refusing to fade. He isolated a cluster of human navigation beacons left behind, their signals too stable, too precise, almost intentional. "Commander," he tried once more. "There is a possibility this is a controlled maneuver." Veilthar cut him off. "All maneuvers are controlled, officer. The only question is whether they succeed, and in this case, they do not alter the outcome." Within the human fleet, another display illuminated, revealing a vast spatial corridor mapped across multiple systems, marked by dozens, no, hundreds, of dormant nodes waiting in silence. "All anchors are in position," an engineer confirmed. "We just need more time to pull them deeper." The commander glanced at the countdown, then back to the advancing enemy vectors,
which were alerting faster than anticipated. "They think we are ramming," she said under Havlis. "So let's give them the perfect retreat. A brief silence for load before see a dead. Initiate Phase 1 when Zakros markers 3. Yes, madam." Hands heavied over controls, but nothing activate yet. Not yet. Everything remained still waiting.
And in the vast emptiness between the two forces, where false signals and real ones intertwined into an invisible maze, the alien fleet surged forward, deeper and faster, confident in a victory they believed inevitable. While ahead of them, the void seemed to open in silent invitation, calm to the point of suspicion, but to minds that trusted only logic, that silence meant only one thing. The enemy had nothing left. None of them, save one, realized they were no longer chasing humanity, but moving exactly where humanity had already decided they would go. The alien armada advanced without hesitation, thousands of ships accelerating in flawless synchronization as they crossed deeper into the abandoned human sector, their engines bending space-time into smooth, controlled distortions. Every trajectory calculated, every vector optimized, the entire movement resembling not a chase, but an execution of inevitability. On the flagship,
ハイコマンドラーバイルザーはタクティカルディスプレイがリアルタイムで進化するのを観測し、人間シグネチャーが散乱するのを観測し、小さなクラスターが形成を破るのを観測し、larger vessels lagging behind as if damaged or disorganized, and to any rational analysis, it confirmed the same conclusion again and again. Collapse was no longer approaching, it had already begun. Increase forward pressure,
Veilthar ordered. Compress their escape quarters. Do not allow regrouping. Commands rippled outward instantly, relayed across the fleet with machine precision, tightening the net around a prey that appeared increasingly incapable of resistance. Saren stood at his station, monitoring the deeper telemetry rather than the surface-level tactical projections. And what he saw refused to align with the narrative everyone else had accepted. The human retreat vectors, though fragmented in appearance, maintained consistent spacing at a macro level, like pieces of a pattern too large to be recognized at once. And the abandoned infrastructure, mining stations, relay hubs, defense platforms, showed signs not of destruction, but of deliberate stripping. Critical components removed with efficiency rather than panic. "Commander," he said again, more carefully this time, "resource sites are not being destroyed. They are being emptied. Systematically." Veilthar responded without turning. "A starving force discards what it cannot carry." Saren shook his head slightly. "No, sir. They are taking only what matters, leaving behind functional shells and the beacon network." He expanded a cluster on his display, highlighting dozens of navigation signals left active. "These signals are too consistent. They are guiding movement." A pause followed, brief but noticeable, before another officer interjected. "Guiding us, perhaps?" The suggestion carried a faint edge of irony, but Saren did not smile. "Yes," he said quietly.
possibly.
Far ahead, within the human withdrawal corridor, the illusion deepened. Civilian frequencies bled into military channels. Distress calls overlapped with fragmented orders. Entire squadrons appeared to lose coordination before abruptly correcting course, creating the impression of a force barely holding itself together. But beneath that chaos lay something else entirely.
A structure invisible, unless one know where to look. Aboard the human command ship, the same comes persisted. Officers tracking not just their own fleet, but every movement of the pursuing enemy. Enemy vanguard has crossed Marker 1, a tactical officer reported. Ferocity increasing beyond projected estimates. The commander leaned forward slightly, studying the updated vectors.
They're committing faster than expected, she murmured.
Good, that reduces uncertainty. Another officer glanced at her. Or reduces our margin for error. She allowed herself the faintest hint of a smile. We accounted for that.
A new layer appeared on the human tactical display, one not visible on any alien sensor grid. A lattice of dormant points stretching across the void like an unseen web, each node silent, inactive, waiting. Anchor nodes remain undetected, an engineer confirmed. Passive signatures holding, no deviation. The commander nodded. Maintain silence. No early triggers. We need them deeper. She shifted her gaze to a secondary feed showing the scattered remnants of their own forces, the ones playing the most dangerous roles in the deception. Status of rear elements? Sustaining controlled losses, came the reply, carefully worded, within acceptable parameters. A brief silence followed, heavier than before, but she did not look away. Hold them as long as possible, she said, her voice steady. They buy us the kill zone.
Back on the Arian's flagship, the sense of momentum grows stronger with every passing moment. Projections update to show an increasingly constrained human escape path. Their outer formations are collapsing inward, an officer reported. We can encircle within 2 cycles. Veilthar considered this, then issued a refined directive. Advance secondary fleets along flanking vectors. Cut off lateral movement. Force them deep or into the cordial. The display shifted according green red markers, extending like closing jaws. And to everyone present, it looked like the final stage of a hunt, inevitable and precise. Saren, however, felt the pattern tightening in a different way. He overlaid the human retreat paths with the positions of the abandoned beacons, then with the projected advance routes of their own fleet, and for a brief, chilling moment, the lines aligned too perfectly, converging not randomly, but toward a shared region of space. Commander, he said, urgency breaking through his usual restraint. Our pursuit vectors are aligning with their beacon network. We are following a path they have defined. Veilthar finally turned slightly, not fully, but enough to acknowledge the statement. And? He asked. If they intended to guide us, they would need the capability to predict our movement with extreme accuracy, Saren replied, which would require understanding our decision models at a level we have not observed. Veilthar's response was immediate. Then your conclusion contradicts itself, officer. The fleet surged onward. On the human side, another marker brink on the display, then another, each one representing a certidec, crossed by the advancing enemy. They've passed marker 2, the tactical officer said. Formation density increasing. They're compressing their own spacing to maintain pursuit pressure. The commander exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly. Perfect, she whispered. They're doing our work for us. An engineer glanced up. All systems ready for phase 1. She checked the timing, the positions, the convergence of every moving piece, human and alien alike. And for the first time since the operation began, there was the faintest hint of tension in her voice. Not fear, but anticipation sharpened to its edge. Not yet, she said. We wait for marker 3. Between the two forces,
The void remained silent, but it was no longer empty. Invisible lines of intent crisscrossed the darkness, human intersecting with alien security, each side believing itself to be in control of the outcome. Yet only one had chose the ground upon which that outcome would be decided. And as the alien's fleet pushed forward,
deeper into the Koread curved by Zirin Mi, the distance between sincerity and catastrophe now two are small to nothing. To go alarm had what be to regard, no warning issued, and though systemum on their side recognized the shape of the trap closing around them, the Aryan free to cross to a markers, slee without knowing it existed. Their formation tightening as predicted, swan twos of vessels complicing into. Proust you to emitteri optimized for maximum pressure, every calculation reinforcing the same conclusion. Victory was no longer theoretical, but imminent. On the flagship, ハイコマンドラーバエルザーは、クワイエットセレンティティとして、プロジェクションズがリアルタイムでアップデートされ、ヒューマンエスケープベクターがインワードに崩壊し、残った船がファンネルドに狭い、corridor of space that seemed to offer no viable exit. They are contained, an officer reported. Final encirclement achievable within one cycle. Veothar gave a slight nod. Proceed, he said,
his tone unchanged, absolute. And across the fleet, commands propagated instantly. Secondary wings adjusting angles, flanking groups accelerating to seal off any lateral movement. The entire armada moving as a single, unified intelligence, closing in on a broken enemy. Saren, however, felt the shift the moment it happened. Not through any alarm or system alert, but through the absence of expected noise. The deeper telemetry streams, background-raising shown fractuations, micro-distortions in space-time, signal echo patterns had changed, subtrivet and denabulary, as if the environment itself had begun to respond to something and seeing, his orated the data, running rapid comparisons against baseline readings from earlier in the pursuit, and the deviation was consistent across multiple vectors, forming a pattern that did not originate from their own fleet. "Commander," he said, voice tighter than before, "we are entering a region of non-random spatial interference." Veothar did not look away from the main display. "Define interference," he replied. "Localized distortions," Saren said. "Low amplitude but synchronized. They are structured." A pause followed, and for the first time, it was not immediately dismissed. "Source?" Veothar asked. "Unknown," Saren admitted, "but it aligns with the human beacon network." Another officer leaned in, scanning the data. "Residual artifacts," he suggested. "Abandoned infrastructure." "Nothing more." Setting shook his head. "No, this is active, or enlisted, waiting." Far ahead within the human command vessel, a single indicator shifted from amber to green, then another, then dozens more cascading across the display like silent confirmations. "Enemy vanguard has crossed marker 3, the tactical officer announced, unable to fully suppress the edge in his voice. "All primary targets are inside the corridor." The commander stood still for a moment, eyes fixed on the map, watching the red mass of the alien fleet stretch deep into the lattice they had built. Every projection aligning, every variable converging toward the point of no return. "All units, confirm readiness," she said, her voice steady but carrying weight now. Acknowledgements came back instantly from across the human network. Scattered fleets, hidden platforms, dormant nodes, all reporting the same status. Ready. An engineer glanced at her. "We won't get a second chance," he said quietly. She didn't look at him. "We don't need one." Back on the Aryan. Flagship, the first anomaly came impossible to ignore, as a section of forward ships report to minor navigation drift.
Nothing critical, but an after to trigger automatic collections adjusting course. One captain report, local space-time variance detected. Another forward, senses experiencing interference, recalibrating. Vile Zosgate's sharp duns rightly. Quantify, he ordered.
Data streamed in, models updated, and for a brief moment, the projections flickered, not failing, but hesitating. Variance remains within acceptable thresholds, an officer concluded. No impact on operational effectiveness. Veilthar accepted this without hesitation. Maintain advance, he said. But Saren was already digging deeper, overlaying the interference patterns with their fleet's current positions, and what he saw made his breath catch. The distortions were not random fluctuations. They formed a grid, vast and precise, with nodes positioned exactly where the human beacons had been left behind. "Commander," he said, louder now, "the interference is structured. It forms a network. We are inside it."
Silence followed. Heavier this time. "What function does it serve?" Veilthar asked.
Saren hesitated, not because he lacked data, but because the implication defied the assumptions they had built their entire strategy upon. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But it is not passive," another officer scoffed lightly. "Even if it is a network, what could it possibly do? Disrupt navigation? We have already compensated." Saren's eyes remained locked on the expanding model, watching. On the human command ship, the final confirmation arrived. Every marker crossed, every target committed. The corridor no longer a path, but a cage, invisible and absolute. The commander exhaled once, slow and controlled, then gave the order that had been waiting since the beginning. "Initiate Phase 1. Nothing happened. At least, nothing visible. For a fraction of a second, the battlefield remained unchanged. The alien fleet still advancing, the human forces still retreating. The void still silent. Then the stars themselves seemed to blink. Across the entire region, the dormant nodes activated simultaneously, not with explosive force, but with precision, emitting synchronized pulses that rippled through space-time like the tightening of an unseen net. The subtle distortions Saren had detected surged in amplitude, linking together into a cohesive structure that wrapped around the advancing fleet, locking coordinates, unchoring positions, redefining the geometry of movement itself. "Commander, Sarely bigging," but the rest of his words due out as systems across the flagship lit up with cascading alerts, not failures, but constraints. Navigation pathways collapsing into narrow channels, jump calculations returning impossible solutions, escape vectors folding back into the corridor they had just traversed. "Report," Veilthar demanded, his voice still controlled, but sharper now. "We are experiencing spatial restriction," an officer replied. "Our movement is being limited," another added, disbelief creeping in. "It's not jamming, it's shaping the space around us." Saren stared at the display, realization hitting with cold clarity. "It's a containment field," he said, barely above a whisper. "Not physical, geometric." Veilthar's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Saren swallowed. "They're not trapping us with force," he said. "They're trapping us with math." On the human side, the commander watched the lattice come alive, every node now active, every line of the invisible structure holding firm. The corridor sealed behind the enemy, their advance halted not by walls, but by the sudden impossibility of moving freely. "Phase 1 complete," the tactical officer reported, almost in awe. She nodded once, her expression unchanged. "Good," she said. "Now they understand where's there." She leaned us rightly closer to the display as reflecting the trapped enemy freed. "And we haven't even started killing them yet." The first ship didn't explode, it simply stopped. At the very front of the alien vanguard, a cruiser attempting to adjust its trajectory found its engines responding perfectly, yet producing no meaningful displacement. Its vector collapsing into a narrow, predetermined path as if space itself had decided where it was allowed to exist. Navigation failure, its captain reported, though the systems showed no damage, no interference, only constraint. And then the second ship experienced the same, and the third, and within seconds, the entire forward line of the Armada began to compress unnaturally, their flawless formation warping into something tighter, denser, less controlled. Like a blade forced into a sheath that was suddenly too small. On the flagship, alarms multiplied. Not the chaotic blare of system failure, but the sharp, relentless cascade of limitations being imposed faster than they could be calculated. Around, all forward vectors limited. One officer curled out. Course collection routes leaderninging now this is placement. Another odd. Jump drives and Everald to Akire bide the existed coordinates. Veilthar stood unmoving at the center of it all, his mind processing the data at speeds that would overwhelm lesser beings. Yet for the first time, the outcome did not resolve cleanly. Override constraints, he ordered. Force recalculation across all navigation systems. Commands spread instantly. Engines flared brighter. Space-time bent harder. But the result did not change. Every attempt to break free simply fed back into the same invisible structure, as if the laws they relied on had been rewritten within this region. Saren didn't look at the chaos. He looked at the pattern. His display filled with the lattice now fully active, each node linked to the next, forming a three-dimensional grid that intersected precisely with the positions of their fleet. "It's locking relative positions," he said, voice low but urgent. "Not absolutely, but relationally. Every ship is being constrained in reference to the others and to the nodes." He expanded the model, showing how movement in one direction increased resistance in another, how attempts to accelerate only tighten the boundaries further. "The more we push, the more it holds." Veilthar finally turned fully toward him. "Then we reduce force," he said, adapting instantly. "Stabilize formation.
Minimize motion. We will analyze and disengage. The order was transmitted and across the fleet. Engine throttled down. Movement slowed. The once aggressive past, it's shifting to control the stillness. For a moment, it works. The strain eased. The distortions stabilized, and the fleet held position within the invisible cage, no longer compressing, no longer forcing itself deeper into constraint. "A temporary equilibrium fondo, fragibulu battoriaru," and the officer spoke with cautious relief. "We have stabilized, Commando. Vaeruzaru no the once." "Good. Now we..." He stopped mid-sentence as a new signal appears on the tactical display. Not from the ion systems, but from everywhere at once.
Human.
Across every frequency, every channel, every spectrum the alien fleet could detect, a single transmission propagated. Clean, clear, unmistakable. Cutting through the noise with deliberate precision. And for the first time since the engagement began, the humans were no longer pretending to be broken.
"This is Human Command," the voice said, calm, steady, carrying a weight that was impossible to ignore. "You are now inside a controlled battle space." Silence followed on the alien bridge. Not enforced, but inevitable. Saren felt it then. Not just the realization of the trap, but the scale of it, the intention behind it. This was not a last stand, not a desperate gamble. It was design. "Commander," he began, but Veilthar raised a hand slightly, not to silence him, but because he was already listening. "We call it a killer zone," the human voice continued. "Like now, you are experiencing Phase 1, containment. You cannot advance, you cannot retreat. And more importantly, you cannot choose your own battlefield
and I more.
Several officers began issuing countermeasures immediately. Attempts to jam the signal, isolate its source, disrupt its propagation. But it made no difference. The transmission wasn't coming from a single point. It was being relayed through the very structure surrounding them, embedded within the lattice itself. "Impossible," one officer muttered. "They've integrated communication into the field," Setting collected quietly. "No. They built the field for this." Valthar stepped forward slightly, eyes fixed on the display, on the representation of his fleet. No longer an advancing force, but a contained mass within a geometry he did not control. "What is Phase 2? He asked, not to his officers, but to the void itself. As if in answer, the human voice returned, almost polite. "Now we start shaping the battlefield." The first detonation didn't come from ahead or behind, but from within. One of the previously abandoned mining platforms, long dismissed as irrelevant, flared to life for a fraction of a second before releasing a concentrated burst of energy directly into the constrained space around it. The effect was immediate and devastating. Not because of raw power, but because the target ships had nowhere to go. The blast expanded, collided with the invisible boundaries of the lattice, and reflected, amplifying itself within a confined volume until the nearest vessels were torn apart under pressure they could neither evade nor dissipate. "Localized energy spike," an officer shouted. "Multiple ships destroyed, no escape vectors." Before the report even finished, a second detonation triggered, then a third, each one perfectly timed, perfectly placed, turning the very space around the fleet into a weapon. "They're using our density against us," Saren said, watching the cascading impacts, the way each explosion fed into the constraints, how every attempt to maneuver only worsened exposure elsewhere. "This isn't bombardment," he added. "It's controlled collapse." Valthar's mind raced through counter-strategies. Dispersal, shielding, sacrificial vectors, but every option relied on freedom of movement they no longer possessed. "Return fire," he ordered. "Target all known human positions." Weapons arrays across the fleet lit up. Beams and projectiles launched toward the coordinates where human forces were expected to be. But most of them hit nothing, passing through empty space or striking inactive husks. Because the real human fleet was no longer where it had been during the retreat. They had already moved. On the human command ship, the commander watched the first wave unfold, her expression unchanged as the enemy formation began to fracture under pressure from within. "Phase 2 is active," the tactical officer confirmed. "Enemy losses increasing exponentially." She nodded once. "Maintain sequence. Do not rush it. Let the system do the work." An officer glanced at the casualty projections, both theirs and the enemy's, and hesitated. "They're trying to stabilize," he said. She followed his gaze to the display, where the alien fleet struggled to adapt, to find any pattern, any logic that would free them. "Of course they are," she replied quietly. "They still think this is a battle." She leaned back slightly, eyes never leaving the trapped armada. "It's not," she said. "It's a process." The alien fleet did not panic, because panic required the acceptance of loss, and loss had not yet been calculated as inevitable. Instead, they adapted, or at least attempted to, thousands of ships running simultaneous recalculations, shifting power from propulsion to shielding, redistributing formation density, trying to convert the imposed constraints into something predictable, something servable, because to them, every problem was ultimate system waiting to be understood. On the flagship, High Command Raverezer, taught this center of a storm of data, projections, fracturing, and reforming as new variables was introduced it faster. Dan models could stabilize reduce craster done stidity to 20%. He ordered stagger positions along vertical axis, create microvariants in relative spacing.
Commands the executed instantly, and across the trapped armada, ships stunted to spread. Not outward, which was impossible, but within the narrow tolerances allowed by the lattice, sliding along invisible boundaries like particles confined within a rigid structure. And for a moment, the casualty rate slowed. The chain reactions dampened slightly.
The system, responded.
They are learning,
Saren said, watching the adjustments propagate, his voice no longer filled with doubt, but with a quiet, grim certainty. They're treating the constraints as variables. Veilthar nodded once. Because that is what they are, he replied, and variables can be solved. He turned slightly, eyes narrowing at the evolving model. If the structure defines our limits, then we redefine the structure through interaction. Saren hesitated. Commander, with respect, this structure was designed by them. Veilthar's response was immediate. Then it contains assumptions, and assumptions can be broken.
Across the battlefield, the detonations continued, but they were no longer random in appearance. Each blast now triggered subtle shifts in the lattice, redistributing pressure, altering the geometry of constraint in ways both sides could observe. The humans had built a system, but now the aliens were inside it, interacting with it, pushing against it, learning its behavior in real time. On the human command ship, the tactical officer flown's light ream as new data came in, an enemy adaptation detected. Specifically were fully linked with enemy with heliport. Zia's reducing exposable exposited in Georgia's government. Miss People across late to decreasing, the commander watched the same projections, her expression unchanged, but her eyes sharper now. Of course they are, she said quietly. They're not stupid. An engineer looked up from his station.
If they map enough of the lattice, they might find a way to exploit it. A brief silence followed. Then the commander nodded once. Then we don't let them finish the map.
She stepped forward slightly, her voice cutting cleanly through the controlled calm of the bridge. Initiate Phase 3.
On the alien flagship, the shift was immediate, though not yet understood. The lattice, which had until now acted as a passive constraint, began to change. Nodes pulsing in new sequences, connections reconfiguring, the geometry itself evolving. Spatial structure is shifting, an officer reported, confusion creeping into his tone. Previous constraints no longer consistent. Saren's eyes wide-eyed as he tracked the changes. They are reprogramming it, he'd said, realization hitting hard. The entire field is dynamic. Well, that's guy's hard-eyed. Then it is not a structure, he'd said. It is a system. And systems could escalate. The next detonation proved it. A cluster of alien ships, previously stabilized within acceptable parameters, suddenly found their relative positions recalculated by the shifting lattice, their safe spacing collapsing into overlap zones where energy from even minor impacts amplified catastrophically. A single targeted strike from a hidden human platform ignited the cluster, not with brute force, but with precision, triggering a cascade that the fleet could not redistribute in time. The explosion didn't expand outward. It folded inward, compressed by the very constraints that had once protected them, turning a controlled environment into a pressure chamber. And in seconds, an entire segment of the formation vanished. "Loss is spiking," an officer shouted. "Containment parameters have changed. Previous solutions invalid." Veilthar did not react outwardly, but the speed of his commands increased. Recalculate all formations. Prioritize adaptability over stability. No fixed patterns. Saren looked at the projections, watching as every attempt to establish order was immediately countered by the shifting lattice.
Every patan identified was rendered of Sarit moment's return. Commando ten, he said slowly. They're just trapping us. There's all finished the tart, his voice cold nar.
They're forcing us to keep solving a problem that keeps changing. On the human side, the commander observed the same evolution from a position of control, the lattice responding to their inputs, reshaping the battlefield in real time. They're adapting faster than expected, the tactical officer admitted, but they're still reacting. She nodded slightly. Exactly, she said. They're inside the loop. The engineer glanced at her. Loop? She didn't look away from the display. Every move they make feeds data into the system. Every adjustment they attempt teaches us how they think, how they solve, how they prioritize. She paused for a fraction of a second, then added, and the system learns faster than they do. Another section of the alien fleet attempted a coordinated maneuver, dozens of ships aligning to create a synchronized push against a single vector, concentrating force in an effort to break through a perceived weakness in the lattice. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. The constraint along that axis loosened slightly, movement increasing beyond previous limits. We have partial displacement, an alien officer reported, hope flickering for the first time. Saren saw it too, the anomaly, the deviation from the pattern. Commander, there... But before he could finish, the lattice shifted again, the weakness collapsing into a reinforced boundary, and the concentrated formation, now perfectly aligned for escape, found itself perfectly aligned for destruction, as multiple dormant nodes activated simultaneously around it, releasing synchronized but that converged inward, amplifying within the constrained space, and in an instant, the Enter-Aya group was Aresdent. Hope vanished just as quickly. They anticipated it, Saren said, his voice hollow now. They let us find that path. Veilthar's silence this time was longer, heavier, not from indecision, but from the recognition of a deeper problem. No, he said finally. They needed us to choose it. Across the battlefield, the pattern became clear. Not just to Saren, but to anyone capable of seeing beyond immediate data. The humans were not merely attacking, not merely defending. They were shaping decisions, guiding actions, turning every attempt at resistance into another step deeper into the system they controlled. On the human command ship, the commander watched the latest collapse, her expression unchanged. But there was no satisfaction in it, only focus. Phase 3 stable, the tactical officer reported. Enemy strategic variance decreasing. She nodded once. Good, she said. That means they're running out of options. She leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the shrinking, struggling mass of the alien fleet. Prepare Phase 4, because inside the cure zone, there was one true steed. Enemy was only just beginning to understand. There was no exit. For the first time since Shinta entering the Curl Zone, the alien fleet did something the system had not predicted fast enough. They stopped at trying to win, and chose instead to survive. Across the flagship, High Commander Veilthar stood in absolute stillness as the evolving lattice continued to shift around them, every previous strategy collapsing under its dynamic nature. Every attempt at optimization feeding data back into a system that learned faster than they could adapt. And in that moment, he made a decision that broke from every doctrine his species had ever followed. All units, he said, his voice cutting through the command network with unmistakable authority. Abandon formation logic. Abandon efficiency protocols. Abandon predictive alignment. Operate independently. The order rippled outward, and for a fraction of a second, hesitation flickered across the fleet, because what he had just commanded was not adaptation. It was chaos. Saren looked up sharply, disbelief flashing across his expression. Commander, that will destroy coordination. Veilthar did not look at him. Coordination is being used against us, he replied. They are predicting us because we are predictable. His gaze hardened, fixed on the shifting lattice. So we stop being predictable. And then, the alien fleet broke, not into panic, but into something far more dangerous: unpatterned motion. Ships began executing maneuvers with no shared logic, no synchronized vectors, each captain making independent decisions based on local conditions rather than centralized command. Trajectories overlapped, diverged, conflicted. Some ships accelerated into constraints, while others decelerated unpredictably, creating micro-variation in spacing that is Stuggriever to mediate relick and sail. And for the first time since Phase 3 began, the Kreen exploitable patterns the humans had been feeding on. 10-10-10 broad. On the human command ship, the change was immediate and jarring. Enemy behavior deviation detected, the tactical officer reported. They're no longer following consistent decision trees. The engineer frowned at his console. Prediction models losing accuracy. 10%. 20. No. 30. The commander's eyes narrowed slightly, watching the once orderly enemy formation dissolve into something far more chaotic. He changed the rules, she said quietly. Not surprised, but not dismissive either. Across the kill zone, the effects compound rapidly the radius, designed to anticipate and react to structured movements. Begin to rag into micro-adjustments. Not failing, but encountering noise where there had once been clarity. Detonations still occurred, but some now struck less optimal configurations. Some chains failed to fully propagate, and in one sector, a cluster of alien ships, moving erratically, unpredictably, managed to slip through a narrowing constraint boundary before it fully reconfigured. "We have displacement," an alien captain shouted, almost disbelieving. "Partial escape vector achieved." Saren saw it instantly, highlighting the anomaly. "Commander, a segment has broken alignment with the lattice's predictive envelope." Vilthar's voice remained steady, but there was something new beneath it. Not confidence, not yet victory, but possibility. "Expand it," he ordered. "All units increase variance, maximum deviation, force the system to chase us." And for the first time, the cure zone did not feel absolute. On the human side, alarms did not sound, but attention sharpened instantly. "We have leakage," the tactical officer said, pulling up the affected sector. "Small but growing," the engineer added. "The lattice is compensating, but it's reacting slower than before." The commander watched the anomaly spread, small fractures forming in what had once been a perfect containment. "They've identified the dependency," she said. "Pattern reliance." She exhaled slowly, then straightened, decision already forming. "Good." The officers around her glanced at one another. Good was not the word they expected. "They think chaos is freedom," she continued, her voice calm, controlled. "But chaos is just another variable." She turned slightly, eyes locking onto the evolving system display. "And variables can be bounded." Another explosion rippled through the field, but this time, the chain reaction stopped short, dissipating before full amplification as nearby ships shifted unpredictably. "See that?" the engineer said. "They're disrupting propagation." The commander nodded once. "Yes," she said, "and in doing so, they're creating something else." She tapped a control, bringing up a new layer of analysis, one that tracked not positions, not formations, but variance itself, mapping the degree of unpredictability across the entire enemy fleet. And as the data populated, a new pattern began to emerge, not in where the ships were, but in how they behaved. Clusters of high deviation, zones of relative stability. Pockets where chaos speaks and the thars, where it inevitable rediminish it, because even randomness had limits. "They can't sustain it," she said quietly. Back in the Aryan flagship, CERN watched the same evolution from the opposite perspective, who prizing careflues as more ships slip east partly outside optimal. Constraint zones as the lattice struggled to fully enclose every erratic movement. "Commander, it's working," he said. "The system can't fully adapt to non-patterned behavior." Veilthar nodded slightly. "No system can adapt instantly," he replied. "We are creating delay." But even as he said it, he continued to watch the broader picture, the entire battlefield, not just the localized gains, because something about it still felt controlled.
"Commander," Saren added, "if we can expand the fracture, we may be able to open a full escape corridor."
Veilthar did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the shifting lattice, on the way it responded, not randomly, but methodically, absorbing the chaos, redistributing constraints, learning just as it had before, only now from a different input. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the fractures began to stabilize, not closing, but being shaped.
"They're adapting," Saren said,
The realization creeping back in, colder this time.
"even to this."
On the human command ship, the commander watched the same stabilization occur, the variance map settling into defined zones, the chaos no longer truly chaotic, but categorized, anticipated, integrated into the system's response loop. "There it is," she said softly, almost to herself. "The boundary." She turned to her officers, her voice steady, final.
Phase 4.
Across the lattice, the nodes pulsed, not in reaction but in synchronization with the newly mapped variance patterns, constraints shifting not to eliminate chaos, but to channel it, narrowing high-variance zones into corridors that felt like escape paths, guiding erratic movement toward specific regions of space, regions already prepared, already primed, already waiting.
On the Arian's flagship, Selin's eyes wide, and as the data update, "Commander, 10-10-10, the fractures, 10-10-10, they're becoming consistent." Bealdair's expression did not change, but the silence that followed was heavy as any before. "Yes," he said slowly.
And for the first time since the trap had sprung, he understood. They're letting us break it. Another cluster surged forward, following the widening corridor, ships moving freely, too freely, escaping the worst of the constraints, the promise of open space just ahead, just within reach, and far beyond them, unseen. The next phase waited.
Because the trap had not been broken.
It had only changed shape. The corridor looked real. That was the first and most important detail. Not because it existed, but because it behaved exactly as an escape route should. Constraints weakened along its axis. Spatial resistance dropped to near zero. Navigation systems returned clean solutions for forward vectors. And for the first time since the trap had activated, alien ships moved without immediate correction or restriction, accelerating into what appeared to be open space. Across the fractured fleet, the reaction was instant. Units closest to the widening path surged forward, abandoning caution in favor of momentum, because survival had finally presented itself as something tangible, something measurable, something they could reach.
Escape corridor confirmed. An officer reported from the flagship, his voice title with restrained adjurancy. Multiple units achieving stable displacement beyond previous constraints.
Saren tracked the same data, watching as clusters of ships poured into the opening, their erratic movement now aligning, not through command, but through convergence. Every independent decision pointing toward the same outcome. "Commander, this might be it," he said, not fully convinced, but unable to deny the evidence. "The system is weakening along that vector." Vilazarl did not respond immediately, his eyes fixed on the corridor, on the way it had formed, the way it was holding, the way it was being used.
Because it was too green. Maintain of Zavishan, he said finally. Do not commit full freet. But even as the order got out, portions of the armada had already moved. Drawn by the sudden absence of constraint, by the instinct, no, the logic of escape, and the corridor widened further,
accommodating the influx, stabilizing under the pressure of movement, reinforcing the illusion that it was real. On the human command ship, the atmosphere had shifted, not into tension but into precision. Every movement now was measured against a final threshold, every variable accounted for, every deviation mapped and integrated. "They're taking it," the tactical officer said, almost under his breath, watching the enemy pour into the designated channel. "Of course they are," the commander replied, her voice calm, controlled. "We taught them to." She zoomed out the display, revealing the full structure of the battlefield, not just the corridor, but everything surrounding it, the lattice, the nodes, the pressure zones, all aligning toward a single point far ahead of the advancing enemy. "Lock all trajectories," she ordered. "No adjustments beyond this point."
An engineer glanced up. "No corrections?" She shook her head slightly. "If we adjust now, we introduce uncertainty." Her eyes remained fixed on the converging vectors. "And we don't need to guide them anymore."
Back in the areas, flagship Seren's returns. Strangely now, Kutser the fragile fruits that had begun to form. "Commando. 10. The corridor is too stot evil," he said, pro-ring up comparative models. "It's not fluctuating like the rest of the lattice, it's consistent." Veilthar's gaze sharpened. "Consistency implies design," he said, and in that moment the realization struck fully, not as a suspicion, but as certainty. "This is not an escape path," he said quietly, but it was already too late.
"Commander," an officer shouted, "forward units have crossed the boundary." The corridor collapsed, not outward, not violently, but inward, folding in on itself as the lattice reconfigured in perfect synchronization, the open path snapping shut behind the advancing ships while simultaneously constricting ahead of them, sealing the entire segment of the fleet inside a newly defined volume of space, smaller, denser, inescapable. The effect was instantaneous. Ships that had been moving freely just moments before now found themselves compressed into proximity zones far beyond safe tolerances, their own momentum working against them, their velocities redirected by shifting constraints that allowed no deviation.
"It's another containment layer," Saren shouted, his voice breaking for the first time.
"They isolated the forward elements."
Veilthar did not move. On the human side, the command words to the crows are complete. The corridor gone, replaced by a concentrated killtrooper, fermed from the very path the enemy had chosen. "Phase 4 containment achieved," the tactical officer confirmed. "Forward enemy mass isolated." She nodded once. "Begin final shaping."
Inside the isolated volume, the situation deteriorated instantly. The ships trapped within attempted to decelerate, to spread, to regain control, but there was nowhere to go. Every vector looped back, every adjustment fed into the constraints tightening around them. "We're compressed beyond safe limits," an alien captain reported. "Shields overlapping, energy feedback rising." Another voice cut in. "We're colliding. No, we're being forced into..." The transmission cut out as the first chain reaction began. This time, there were no external detonations. The destruction came from within. The density reached a critical threshold, and the lattice did the rest, amplifying interactions between ships, converting minor energy exchanges into cascading overloads, turning shields into weapons, engines into pressure sources, the entire cluster becoming a self-contained storm of energy with no release, no dissipation, only escalation. And in seconds, the isolated fleet segment ceased to exist as individual units, collapsing into a single catastrophic event contained entirely within the boundaries of the system. Silence followed. Not true silence, but the absence of that entire section of the battlefield.
On the flagship, no one spoke.
Saren stared at the empty space where hundreds of ships had been moments before, his mind struggling to reconcile what he had just witnessed.
They made us choose it," he said, the words barely forming.
Veilthar remained still, his gaze fixed on the display. But now there was no illusion left, no uncertainty, only understanding.
They didn't trap us, he said slowly. They taught us how to trap ourselves. Across the battlefield, the remaining alien forces pulled back, what little they could, reducing movement, abandoning any attempt at escape. But it no longer mattered. The system had already adapted, already learned, already advanced to its final configuration. And on the human command ship, the commander watched it all unfold with the same quiet focus she had held from the beginning.
Phase 4 complete, the tactical officer said, almost in disbelief. Enemy numbers dropping Billos to Strategic's less holded. See Jeebus single, small Nord.
Then we finish it, she said.
Because the enemy had fully understands the truce.
And understanding came far too late. What remained of the alien fleet did not resemble an armada anymore. It was a fractured mass suspended inside a system that no longer needed to prove its control, only to complete its function. And for the first time since the beginning of the engagement, there was no forward motion, no pursuit, no illusion of victory, only survival measured in moments. Across the flagship,
ハイコマンドラーバエルザーは前方に戦術的なディスプレイが簡略化されたその姿を見せた。それは明確な理解のプロセスを通じて行われた。それは損失の結果であった。そのディスプレイは彼の戦力の一部を失ったその証だった。Reduced to scattered clusters barely maintaining cohesion, and the lattice surrounding them no longer shifted aggressively, no longer reacted in dramatic reconfigurations. Instead it settled, stabilized, its behavior now precise.
efficient, final. They've stopped adapting, an officer said quietly, almost as if afraid the system itself would hear. The structure is no longer responding to our changes. Saren shook his head slowly. I was fixed on the data. No, 10. It doesn't need to, he pre-ID'd. It already knows everything it needs to know. His hands moved across the console, purling up the last viable projections, searching for any path, any solution that had not yet been explored. But every model returned the same result: convergence toward zero. There are no escape vectors left, he said, the words heavy, undeniable. Veilthar closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, not in defeat, but in calculation. One final attempt to process the unprocessable, to find meaning in a system that had removed meaning from the battlefield itself. And when he opened them again, there was no hesitation left, only decision. All remaining units, he said, his voice steady, carrying across the fleet with absolute clarity.
She's all attempts at Bataan formation. Minimize energy output. Do not engage. Do not register. A ripple of confusion followed, but no one this overed that battle. He continued. Be continued. We are inside and out. Come. So coming to respond, generally sitting the range with no terrical. Response by one is ready for case for meself. Without the day, the city of given with father. This is no clearpagen by limes. There are publishment venature so that feel that replevation comes to minds with many of the chather. The showed of news once give back.
On the human command ship, the shift was immediately detected. Enemy activity dropping across all sectors, the tactical officer reported. They're stabilizing. No offensive maneuvers, no escape attempts. The engineer frowned slightly. They've stopped feeding the system. The commander watched the same data, her expression unreadable for a moment longer than usual. No, she said quietly. They've understood it. A silence settled across the bridge. Not tension, not relief, something else. Recognition. Does it change anything? The tactical officer asked. The commander didn't answer immediately. Instead, she brought up the full system map one last time. The lattice, the nodes, the constrained volumes, all still in place, all still active. The machine they had built continuing its function exactly as designed. And beyond it, the remnants of an enemy that had finally stopped struggling against it. "No," she said at last. "It just means they'll see it happen." Across the battlefield, the final phase began without announcement. The lattice tightened, not abruptly, not violently, but with slow, absolute certainty. Constraints narrowing across every axis, reducing allowable space incrementally, systematically, like a closing equation solving for zero. Ships that had managed to maintain safe distances now found those distances shrinking, not through movement, but through the redefinition of space itself. Spatial compression increasing, an alien officer reported, though there was no urgency in his voice now, only observation. All units approaching minimum separation thresholds. Saren watched the data, no longer searching for a solution, only witnessing the process unfold. "It's uniform," he said. "No weak points.
No variance. 10-10-10. Just convergence.
Veilthar remained still, his gaze steady. "They have removed the concept of escape," he said, not as a question, not even as a statement, simply as fact. The first collisions were gentle, not the violent impacts of uncontrolled movement, but the inevitable contact of objects that no longer had space to exist apart. Shields brushed against shields, energy fields, overlapping, systems compensating automatically, redistributing load. But the system allowed no compensation beyond a certain threshold. And when that threshold was crossed, the consequences followed instantly. One ship's shield overloaded, feeding energy into the constrained volume, amplifying against the lattice boundaries, triggering the next overload, and the next, and the next. A chain reaction not of explosions, but of inevitabilities.
On the human command ship, no one spoke as the final. Gropers unfurled. There was nothing left to command, nothing left to adjust. The system was complete. Phase 5 executing. The tactical officer said quietly, the chapter gyms now. One of the Truth Run store, the Phase 5 executing. The tactical officer said quietly was additional generated to discovered and cruise to the end of the day. The system was complete, there has been its into the day. Phase 5 executing, the tactical officer said quietly was a Phase 5 and a peer of the man. The tactical officer said, Phase 5 executing of the jest. The tactical officer said was a genuinely Phase 5 and a peer of the man. The main state's place to get back, the nother just where did. This system was complete. When they were both 2 other minutes, the system was one discovered there. Sometimes where we got, the US Jesus would struggled it. When their waste improved may not fortunately, something that we were said. This is the US Jesus was spend agreed with an indegreed complete. For me would be a graded television crinement continue. The gyms was made, the just made faced one of the many feel just across the board. The gyms were later to adjust for day, and the chapter said with rate small wearing. The gyms will stare than adjust work was where they make this. The gyms will need this commanded. This system was just of a graded page of the faceable. When they were both together to the gym's speech that is what's not privily demand. The chapter was living 1 states to investment. They were 26 into them. The gyms will help to get it was dead for something. When she said this is an other criming, the gyms were both to man. We're be a big believed in visited with what together. This for taken with a money truth when she willed. One of this was on the criming window system. The gyms were doing some sewed changes with the chapter. The gyms were doing some first of indirective mans, the gyms were stated. One of the dative stage that is what she create the sky. When she said, Someone who coming back, the gyms were needs together. We don't feel Smith the reported window system when she said they were not were turned by chapter minute. They reclined the gyms were wrong the best and the gyms were freighted by Jack. Would she said they were Smith the later window system when she would cried. One of the gyms were not await and the gyms were frayed and get into a minute. We know that the right truth than another where we're doing. When she said one way period of it she prived. When she said they were from away to the gyms were just right. The gyms were not were two when the gyms were not work to the gyms were nothing were demand. The gyms were created by something. One faith of the gyms were desired, which she produced the women.
They're not destroying us, Saren said suddenly, the realization cutting through the quiet on the alien flagship. They're resolving us. Veilthar did not respond, because there was nothing to add. One by one, the remaining ships vanished, not in fire, not in chaos, but in cascading failures that followed perfectly from the conditions imposed upon them, until the battlefield, once filled with thousands of vessels, contained only silence and the faint residual signatures of a system powering down.
Their Togdeed.
The nodes went dark.
The space returned to normal.
And where an armada had once stood, there was nothing. On the human command ship, the final report came in. No remaining enemy signatures detected, the tactical officer said, his voice steady but softer now. The fleet is gone. The commander remained where she was for a moment longer, looking at the empty display, at the absence left behind. Then she exhaled slowly, the first sign of release since the operation began.
End Phase 5, she said. No cheers followed, no celebration.
No relief shouted across the bridge.
Because everyone there understood the same thing. This had never been a battle. It had been a conclusion.
Silence, for a long time, was the only thing left in the Kalar system. Not the tense silence of anticipation, nor the hollow quiet after an explosion, but something deeper, heavier. The kind of silence that follows when an equation has finished resolving and there is nothing left to calculate. Across the empty expanse where an alien armada had once advanced with absolute certainty, there were no wrecks, no drifting debris fields, no burning remnants to mark the scale of what had been lost, only faint distortions fading back into the natural fabric of space, as if the system itself were erasing the last traces of what it had done. On the human command ship, the lights remained steady, the consoles active. But no one moved for several seconds after the final confirmation. All sectors clear, the tactical officer repeated, quieter this time, as though saying it louder might somehow change it. No residual hostiles, no delayed signatures. The engineer leaned back slightly, staring at the empty projection where the lattice had once dominated the display. The system is fully offline, he said. Every node has shut down cleanly. The commander stood at the center of it all, her posture unchanged, her gaze fixed not on the present, but on what had just passed.
Begin recovery operations, she said at last, her voice calm, almost gentle, and the spell broke. Movement returning to the bridge. Officers acknowledging, systems shifting from combat to analysis, drones being dispatched to sweep the area to confirm what they already knew, that there was nothing left to recover. Except data. Hours later, the first full reconstruction of the battle began to take shape, compiled from every sensor log, every system interaction, every recorded decision made by both sides, a complete map of the engagement from beginning to end, not as a narrative, but as a structure, a system layered upon another system until the outcome became inevitable. In a secondary briefing chamber, the Corps command staff gathered in silence as the model played out before them, showing the initial retreat, the bait, the corridor, the containment, the escalation.
every phase unfolding with the same cold precision they had witnessed in real time.
They never stood a chance, one officer said quietly, not as a boast, but as an observation. The commander didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to the display, isolating one segment of the simulation. The moment just before Phase 4, where the alien fleet had broken pattern, where chaos had briefly disrupted the system, where, for the smallest fraction of time, something unexpected had occurred.
They almost did, she said.
The room went still.
She expanded the data, showing the fracture, the deviation, the brief window where the lattice had lagged behind, where the enemy had stepped outside the predicted boundaries. If they had sustained that, she continued, if they had committed fully to non-patterned behavior earlier, they might have forced a failure cascade. The engineer frowned slightly. But they didn't, he said.
She nodded once.
No, she agreed, because they couldn't.
Why? The tactical officer asked.
The commander looked at the model, then at the empty space beyond it, as if the answer existed somewhere between the two. Because they need to control, she said. And we toed that away before the aerial size did it mattered.
Another silence followed a heavy this time.
They were smarter than we thought, the engineer said eventually.
Yes, the commander replied, but not in the way that mattered here.
She turned the display off.
The room diminished rightly, the simulation gone, leaving only the memory of it behind. Kaib the full engagement. CDAR, flagged it for strategic doctrine review. I want every command unit to study all the date worked in. She run the say, the very short to get the memory money of it behind. She realized the state is the memory of it behind. CDARD, I want every command unit to study this. Acknowledgements followed, quiet, efficient. But there was something different in them now. Not pride, not relief, but understanding.
Later, alone on the bridge, the commander stood looking out at the empty void. The system calm, silent, unchanged on the surface, as if nothing had happened at all. And for a moment, she allowed herself to simply observe it, not as a battlefield, not as a system, but as space.
A junior officer approached hesitantly.
"Ma'am," he said, "final confirmation logs are ready. There's one more thing." She didn't turn. "Go on." He swallowed slightly. "We recovered a partial transmission from the enemy flagship just before the end." That made her pause, just slightly. "Play it."
The recording was fragmented, degraded by the collapse of the system around it, but the voice was clear enough.
Valthar. "We were run." The alien command's voice said, stripped it of serenity, but not of clarity. "They do not fight as we do. They do not seek victory. They do find it." A brief distortion cut through the signal. Then the final words, "We were already inside it." The transmission ended. The silence returned. The commander closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again, her gaze steady as ever. "Add it to the archive," she said quietly.
Yes, madam.
The officer left, and she remained where she was, looking out into the void that now held nothing but the absence of an entire fleet. And after a long moment, she spoke. Not to anyone, not to a system, but to the silence itself.
"We don't win batters,
Sieged.
we decide where they end."
And far beyond the Kalar system, as the data of the engagement began to spread through human networks, through command structures, through the quiet, relentless machinery of a species that had learned to survive by thinking differently, a single conclusion took hold, not as propaganda, not as myth, but as fact. The galaxy had believed humans were retreating. They had only been choosing the place where everything else would stop.